The price of desire. Dust swirled across the sun-baked street of the small frontier town as Elias Harper guided his horse to a stop outside the weathered wooden storefront. The air held the faint tang of sweat and hay, mingled with the distant scent of smoke from someone's hearth. Elias, widowed for 3 years, felt the familiar ache of solitude tighten around his chest. His ranch, vast and untamed, offered comfort in labor but little in companionship. Today, though, a whisper of opportunity stirred, a chance to fill the empty spaces that had begun to define his life. Inside the shop, two women moved with practiced ease, their gestures measured and deliberate. Clara's fingers brushed against a set of glass bottles, while Mabel adjusted the hem of her skirt with a careful pull. Their faces remained hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, or obscured by the low angle of the counter, leaving only glimpses of their expressions in the curve of a shoulder or the tilt of a wrist. Elias watched them carefully, noting the subtle grace in Clara's stance and the cautious hesitation in Mabel's movements. They were not just ordinary townsfolk. There was an edge to them, a quiet defiance that piqued his curiosity. The two women's conversation halted as he approached. Clara's hand paused on a bottle, and Mabel's fingers clutched the counter, both betraying the flicker of apprehension beneath composed exteriors. Elias spoke, his voice low and steady. "I'm looking for help. Work around the ranch. Something temporary." He avoided the instinctive loneliness in his tone, focusing instead on practicality. Clara's fingers tapped lightly against the counter, almost inaudibly. Mabel's gaze flicked toward Elias, a shadow of warning passing between them. They exchanged a brief, silent glance that said more than words could. "We'd rather die." One of them murmured softly, a phrase carried in a blend of humor and gravitas, though neither dared meet his eyes directly. The declaration lingered, teasing boundaries even as curiosity beckoned. Elias shifted slightly, considering his options. The transaction before him, $3 for temporary companionship, felt like more than a financial exchange. It was a test, an unspoken negotiation of wills. With a slow motion of his hand, he laid the coins on the counter, their metallic clink resonating in the quiet room. Both women's eyes flicked toward the money. Clara's lips curved in a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, while Mabel's jaw tightened, betraying a silent internal struggle. $3, Elias said, his voice firm yet edged with something softer, almost vulnerable. "Take it or leave it." The simplicity of the offer belied the weight beneath it: connection, danger, temptation. The air thickened as Clara leaned slightly forward, hand hovering above the coins, then withdrew. Mabel's fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that carried tension, curiosity, and unspoken complicity. They whispered to each other in silence, weighing the cost, not just of the payment, but of what crossing this threshold would mean. Finally, with a small nod that seemed almost ritualistic, Clara's hand closed around the coins. Mabel followed, letting her own fingers trail over the counter for a fraction longer, as if memorizing the cold metal. Elias felt a pulse of anticipation, a tremor of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Here were companions, yet the boundaries of propriety, morality, and desire loomed large over every gesture. They stepped outside together, the sun casting long shadows behind them. The women's movements were deliberate, calculated, yet infused with subtle vitality, like dancers navigating an invisible choreography. Elias mounted his horse, glancing at them with the careful attention of a man aware of the fragility of trust. They did not speak, the silence filled instead by the rhythm of hooves on hard-packed dirt and the occasional call of a distant bird. The ride back to the ranch stretched across miles of open land, the horizon rimmed with the gold of late afternoon. Elias, keeping a careful eye on the women, sensed an invisible line drawn between propriety and temptation. Clara's fingers brushed the reins in small, fleeting gestures, while Mabel's hand lingered near the saddle horn, tension barely contained. Both seemed aware of the unspoken agreement between them, and the consequences that awaited should it falter. By the time the ranch came into view, Elias felt the first stirrings of a complicated, dangerous desire. $3 had bought him more than labor. It had opened a doorway to a world he had long avoided, a test of boundaries and hearts. The women's quiet glances, the subtle shifting of weight, and the carefully controlled gestures had set the stage. A storm of longing, secrecy, and possibility hovered just beyond the horizon. And as the sun dipped low, casting the land in amber and shadow, Elias realized that nothing would ever be simple again. Shadows of temptation. The ranch unfolded before them like a silent, sunburned expanse, the wind sweeping across the fields in waves that whispered of isolation and routine. Elias guided the women along the worn path to the main house, the horses' hooves clattering against the uneven ground. Each stride seemed to carry a subtle weight, a sense of anticipation neither spoken nor acknowledged. Clara moved with a grace that seemed inborn, her fingers brushing over fence posts and wooden rails as if memorizing the texture. Mabel's movements were more restrained, eyes darting to shadows and corners, cautious but observant, as though the ranch itself might reveal secrets she was unprepared to face. Inside the house, the light filtered through dusty windows, casting fractured patterns across the floor. Elias set down his hat, the worn leather creaking softly, and began assigning tasks with deliberate calm. Clara followed him readily, her hands smoothing over the coarse fabric of feed sacks, aligning them neatly. Mabel lingered at the threshold, observing the motion, measuring the rhythm of the work before committing herself. It was a delicate dance, cooperation, curiosity, and the silent negotiation of proximity. Their first evening together arrived quietly, wrapped in the dim glow of a lantern. The hearth flickered with amber light, painting the walls in shifting hues. Clara approached the fire, arranging the logs with a deliberate touch, her movements fluid and unhurried. Mabel lingered by the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames, reflecting both weariness and intrigue. Elias watched them, noting the contrast, one drawn toward warmth, one cautious of it. Both were mirrors of his own conflicted desire. A moment of silence stretched, unbroken save for the occasional snap of burning wood. Then, Clara's hand reached toward a folded blanket, brushing Elias's arm in passing. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet charged with meaning. Mabel's eyes widened slightly, betraying a flicker of concern, or perhaps jealousy, though she quickly diverted her attention to the hearth. Elias felt the pull of temptation tighten around him, an invisible tether linking desire and restraint. He shifted in his chair, aware of the moral lines he was approaching, but powerless to retreat entirely. The night deepened, and rain began to tap against the windows in irregular rhythms. The sound filled the room, a private symphony that accentuated the closeness between them. Clara leaned toward the fire, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows across her form. She murmured words that Elias could not fully hear, her voice soft and melodic, touching something long dormant within him. Mabel, still standing at the edge of the room, clenched her fists subtly, her body a study in controlled tension. The dynamic among them shifted imperceptibly, a silent triangle of curiosity, desire, and unease. Later, when the chores were done and the house quiet, Elias lingered by the table, running a hand over its worn surface. Clara approached, placing a cup of water down without a word. The gesture spoke volumes, attentiveness, care, and an unspoken invitation to intimacy. Mabel remained by the doorway, shadowed, watching the exchange with measured restraint. The tension in the room was palpable, electric, threading through the air like fine silk drawn taut. Small touches became moments of revelation. A hand brushing a shoulder, a subtle tilt of the head, fingers lingering on a tabletop, each a note in a silent conversation of desire. Elias felt his own pulse quicken, each motion from the women a reminder of how fragile the boundary between propriety and indulgence had become. Clara's playful glances toward him, though faceless, carried unmistakable intent. Mabel's cautious observation was equally expressive, a counterweight of restraint that only deepened the intrigue. By midnight, the storm outside had grown louder, pounding against the roof with insistent rhythm. Elias rose, checking the locks on doors and windows, while Clara and Mabel moved in tandem, sharing tasks silently. The shared labor, intimate yet faceless, created a tension that vibrated in the small space of the room. It was a delicate equilibrium, precarious and thrilling, the promise of closeness balanced against the risk of moral collapse. As the lanterns dimmed and shadows swallowed the corners of the house, Elias sensed that the fragile peace of the evening would not last. Desire had been awakened. Boundaries had been tested. Each movement, each unspoken glance, carried the weight of decisions yet to be made. The chapter of a night closed on a quiet precipice. Hands nearly touching on the table, hearts quickened, and a silent acknowledgement that tomorrow would demand choices neither fully prepared to confront. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, the pull of temptation against the anchor of conscience. And in that quiet, shadowed room, Elias realized that the rules of his life had already begun to shift, and nothing would ever feel simple again. Entangled hearts. The morning sun spilled across the ranch in muted gold, filtering through gaps in the weathered beams of the barn. Elias moved among the animals with measured precision, yet his mind lingered on the events of the previous night. Clara's subtle touch, Mabel's careful glances, the unspoken tension. They lingered in him like the scent of smoke after a fire. The $3 that had brought these women to his life now seemed trivial, dwarfed by the complications that had quietly taken root. Clara was already at the corral, hands moving deftly as she guided a restless mare into its stall. Her motions were confident, fluid, and filled with a grace that spoke of familiarity with work, but also with observation. She noticed the tilt of his hat, the way his boots pressed into the dirt, the subtle shifts in posture. Each gesture was faceless, yet intensely personal, a language of proximity and intent. Mabel stood nearby, her frame rigid with careful control, keeping her distance while maintaining watch over the pair. The contrast was palpable. Clara leaned into the rhythm of closeness. Mabel recoiled, measuring it. Elias called out instructions, his voice carrying over the paddock. Clara responded promptly, her laughter light and airy, a sound that tugged at his chest. Mabel's reply was precise, clipped, a counterpoint to Clara's warmth. The dynamic among them formed invisible lines, a triangle drawn with tension and unspoken desire. Elias felt caught between two currents, both compelling yet fraught with potential pain. Later, during the midday meal, the tension shifted into sharper relief. The three sat at the rough-hewn table, the sunlight streaming through the windows, striking dust motes in slow motion. Clara reached for a plate, brushing her fingers against his hand as she did so. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet charged with a resonance that neither could ignore. Mabel's fingers hovered over her own plate, a tremor of unease visible in the subtle tightening of her knuckles. She was aware, acutely, of the unspoken preference forming between Elias and Clara, and the jealousy it provoked simmered beneath her calm exterior. The afternoon brought more labor, but each task carried an undertone of emotional weight. Elias instructed them on fence repair, the rhythm of hammer and nail, punctuated by the quiet of observation. Clara worked in tandem with him, moving in sync with his motions, hands brushing accidentally but deliberately. Mabel shadowed them, her posture taut, occasionally redirecting her attention to distant tasks to avoid confrontation. Yet her eyes remained sharp, noting every interaction. The ranch, normally a place of physical work, became a stage for subtle rivalry, layered glances, and intricate social maneuvering. As evening approached, Elias allowed the women a moment's reprieve near the edge of the field. The sky was painted in dusky purples and golds, the wind carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil. Clara leaned against the rail, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, while Elias joined her in silent proximity. Mabel remained slightly apart, her gaze tracing patterns in the horizon, a study in contained emotion. The tension among them had grown taut, almost palpable, and Elias understood that choices were pressing closer with each passing moment. A sudden mishap with a stubborn calf escalated the dynamic further. Elias stepped forward to intervene, Clara close enough for their shoulders to brush. Mabel's reaction was instantaneous. She moved swiftly to assist, her hands steady but her body language brimming with alertness and subtle defensiveness. The physical closeness, even faceless, carried the emotional weight of intimacy and rivalry. It was a dance, a balance of proximity and restraint, each movement loaded with silent declaration. By nightfall, exhaustion settled over the trio, but the emotional storm had only intensified. Elias retreated to the porch, hands gripping the railing as he watched the lantern-lit windows of the house. Clara moved inside, her silhouette blending with the soft glow, while Mabel lingered at the doorway, shadowed and watchful. The unspoken conflict, the pull of attraction, the sting of jealousy, the moral tension, hung heavily in the air. Elias realized, with a mixture of dread and longing, that the simplicity of companionship had already been lost. Desire and rivalry were entwined now, binding the three in a delicate web of emotion that could unravel at any moment. The night closed over the ranch, carrying the promise of confrontation, confession, and choices yet to come. And as the wind stirred the fields, Elias understood that the next day would demand clarity, and hearts would be tested in ways he had not anticipated. The price of passion. The dawn broke slowly over the ranch, casting long, muted shadows across the fields. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, fingers gripping the railing as the first light touched the worn wood. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth from last night's rain. Sleep had been restless, weighed down by the events of the previous days. The tension, the rivalry, the subtle flirtations that had become impossible to ignore. Today demanded reckoning. Inside, the house stirred with cautious movement. Clara's hands moved deliberately across the counters, arranging dishes and wiping surfaces, her motions a mix of habitual efficiency and quiet anticipation. Mabel lingered at the doorway, fingers brushing the wood frame, her posture tense yet composed, as if preparing herself for confrontation. Neither spoke at first. The silence carried its own meaning, dense with unspoken truths and looming decisions. Elias stepped inside, his boots creaking softly against the floor. He looked at the two women, noting the subtle differences in posture, in the tilt of a shoulder, in the rhythm of a hand sweeping the counter. Clara's presence radiated warmth and openness, the way she moved toward him in small gestures, unguarded yet restrained. Mabel's stance was taut, careful, a shield against the vulnerability she both feared and craved. The triangle of desire, tension, and moral complexity had grown undeniable. "Something needs to be said," Elias finally murmured, his voice steady but carrying the weight of long-held emotion. Clara's fingers paused on the cloth she was holding, her head tilting slightly toward him, waiting. Mabel's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed, the tiniest exhale betraying a storm of internal deliberation. The moment was delicate, charged with the unspoken knowledge that choices now bore real consequences. Clara stepped closer, the lantern light catching the edge of her sleeve, the subtle curve of her wrist brushing against Elias's hand as if by accident. The contact, fleeting and faceless, carried the clarity of intention. Mabel moved, almost imperceptibly, placing herself between them, her fingers brushing against the doorway for support, her body language a mixture of assertion and vulnerability. Emotions collided silently. Desire, jealousy, loyalty, and self-respect all intertwining in a tense equilibrium. Elias spoke again, carefully measuring his words. "I care for both of you," he admitted, "but this can't continue as it has." His voice was low, controlled, yet every syllable trembled with sincerity. Clara's hand lingered near his, a silent plea for understanding, while Mabel's posture stiffened, signaling the boundary she had drawn for herself. The room, once a place of quiet labor, now held the weight of moral decision and the fragile calculus of hearts. The confrontation that followed was quiet but intense. Clara and Mabel exchanged gestures, tilted heads, sharp shifts of posture, a hand pressed briefly to the chest, as if speaking in a language only they understood. Elias moved between them, acknowledging each subtle cue. Clara, with a slight nod, indicated willingness to stay, to embrace what had grown between her and Elias. Mabel, after a tense pause, stepped back fully, moving toward the doorway, her departure both dignified and resolute. She had chosen self-respect over passion, a silent victory over the pull of desire. The resolution settled over the house slowly. Clara remained near Elias, their proximity a gentle affirmation of the bond they had nurtured, faceless yet intimate. Hands brushed in small gestures, shared tasks became quiet exchanges, and the air carried the muted warmth of tentative connection. Outside, the ranch stretched endlessly, the horizon wide and open, reflecting both the possibilities and consequences of their choices. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the fields and barn, Elias realized that the simplicity of life had vanished, replaced by the complexities of human desire and loyalty. Clara's presence was a constant, an anchor amid uncertainty, while Mabel's absence left a shadowed space, a reminder of boundaries and moral limits. Every motion, every object, every gesture became imbued with meaning, carrying the lessons of trust, longing, and consequence. By evening, the day closed on quiet resolution. Hands intertwined over a simple meal, shadows lengthened on the porch, and the wind carried whispers of the past and promises for the future. Elias understood that love, passion, and desire came with costs, emotional, moral, and social, but also with rewards, however complicated. The ranch, once merely a place of work, had become a stage for human connection, moral choice, and the subtle dance of hearts. The night settled over the land, deep and expansive, the lanterns casting warm circles of light inside the house. Elias and Clara stood together in quiet acknowledgement, faceless yet fully present, ready to navigate the uncertain path before them. And somewhere in the distance, Mabel's silhouette faded into the horizon, a reminder that desire and consequence are forever intertwined.